2009, Girondins de Bordeaux finished first in their Champions League group, ahead of Bayern Munich and Juventus, with 16 points out of a possible 18. They then reach the quarterfinals, where they are eliminated by Lyon. 15 years later, in 2024, that same club is administratively relegated to the 4th division, notably due to poor financial management. Another example? Lyon, 7 consecutive French league titles in the 2000s. Champions League semi-finalists in 2020 after eliminating Manchester City and Juventus. 5 years later, provisional administrative relegation to Ligue 2 for financial reasons. A decision later overturned on appeal. So, one question arises. How did these major clubs in the French League, which enjoyed strong European campaigns, fall so quickly? And more importantly, how can a league capable of producing teams, and especially players, competitive in Europe simultaneously be in a permanent economic crisis? Because Bordeaux and Lyon are not exceptions. They are symptoms of an entire system. And to understand what is really happening to French football, you only need to look at one thing: money, and above all, where it comes from. Modern professional football relies primarily on one source of revenue: television rights. In the major European leagues, they represent between 40 and 60% of club revenues, depending on the season and sporting performance. In France, this proportion has long been even higher. For some clubs, it has reached up to 65% of the total budget. In other words, a large part of French football's economic model has been built around these audiovisual revenues. And when one resource carries such weight in the financial balance, it mechanically influences everything else: salaries, transfers, and even management models. The stability of the system therefore depends directly on the stability of these rights, and that is precisely where the fragility lies. If we look at the recent domestic TV rights figures in Europe's major leagues, the gap is immediately striking. The Premier League exceeds 3.2 billion euros per season. Then come La Liga, Serie A, and the Bundesliga, each generating over 1 billion euros per season. Until 2025, Ligue 1 was already capped at around 500 million euros per season, 2 to 3 times less than the 4 major leagues. But the situation has worsened from the 2025 to 2026 season onward, with estimates suggesting that the gross total of TV rights linked to the French league would reach 335 million euros. However, once taxes, contributions, repayment of the LFP's building loan, and other costs are deducted, only around 80.5 million euros would remain to be distributed among the 18 Ligue 1 clubs. The French champion would receive approximately 4.67 million euros and the bottom club around 1.44 million euros. These figures are so low that they almost seem unreal in the context of modern football. For comparison, during the 2024 to 2025 season, Montpellier, who finished last in Ligue 1, received 5.18 million euros, nearly 1 million more than what the next champion is expected to earn. In other words, in today's French football landscape, winning the league brings in less money than finishing last did 2 years earlier. Meanwhile, in England, Southampton, who finished bottom of the Premier League in 2025, received 125 million euros, more than the entire French league combined. But domestic figures are, in reality, only part of the problem. The real gap between European leagues lies in international TV rights. Leagues such as the Premier League and La Liga have built their economic power by selling their product on a global scale. Their matches are broadcast in Asia, Africa, and the Americas, with deals negotiated territory by territory. As a result, international revenues account for a massive share of their total audiovisual income. By contrast, the French league remains heavily dependent on its domestic market. Its international rights do exist, but their value remains limited, particularly because Ligue 1's global exposure relies mainly on a few flagship clubs. And in an industry as competitive as modern football, relying on a single economic engine is always a risk. But if the gap between leagues is so wide, it is not only because some sell their product better. It is mainly because, in France, the model collapsed at a very specific moment, at the end of the 2010s. At that point, French football believes it has found its magic formula. AS Monaco lights up Europe by reaching the Champions League semifinals. The league's top talents move abroad for record fees. At the same time, the championship attracts global stars and top prospects. The league sets a clear objective for clubs: reach 1 billion euros in TV rights per year, a symbolic milestone meant to firmly place Ligue 1 among Europe's top leagues. In 2018, The tender process appears to confirm this ambition. Spanish broadcaster MediaPro wins the majority of the packages with an offer close to 800 million euros per season starting in 2020. On paper, it is a revolution. Clubs begin to anticipate this future income. Budgets increase, salaries rise, investments multiply. The problem is that this money is not there yet. MediaPro's model is based on a simple assumption: massively recruiting subscribers. The stated objective is around 4 million. The reality is very different. Barely 600,000 subscribers after a few months. Revenues do not follow, and very quickly, MediaPro fails to meet its payments. After just one installment, the broadcaster defaults. Within a few weeks, the league loses most of the revenue it believed was secured for several years. This is not a gradual decline. It is a sudden collapse. From that moment on, the balance of power changes completely. The league is no longer in a position to sell its rights. It is in a position where it must quickly find a buyer to secure revenue. Contracts become shorter, amounts decrease. The commercial credibility of the league weakens. Later, the deal signed with DAZN falls short of initial expectations and does not last long. The signal sent to the market is clear. The perceived value of the French league has declined, and in an industry built on trust and long-term projections, losing that trust is often more damaging than losing money. It is precisely in this context that some clubs begin to falter. Bordeaux, which had become a major European force 15 years earlier, sees its financial situation deteriorate season after season until administrative relegation. And yet, broadcasters are only part of the equation. Because if the system collapsed so quickly, it is also due to what was happening internally, behind the scenes of French football. If French football is faltering today, it is not only because of TV rights. It is because its economic model relies on three main sources of revenue: TV rights, player sales, and European competitions. The problem is that these three pillars are inherently unstable. TV rights depend on an unpredictable audiovisual market. Player sales depend on the transfer market, and European revenues depend on sporting results. In other words, a large part of French clubs' finances relies on uncertain income. By contrast, in some other leagues, particularly in England, clubs benefit from much stronger commercial resources: international sponsorships, global merchandising, preseason tours, worldwide marketing partnerships. This means their financial stability does not depend solely on sporting performance. In France, it is the opposite. Sporting performance directly determines economic survival. This is where a key concept comes into play to understand the situation: the structural deficit. A structural deficit is not just a one-off bad season. It is a situation in which a club loses money almost every year, even when everything operates normally. In other words, its expenses are consistently higher than its recurring revenues. In that case, to balance its accounts, it must find money elsewhere. And in French football, that solution is almost always the same: selling players. Transfers are therefore not just a sporting choice. They are often a financial necessity. That is why every year many players from the French league move abroad, often for high fees, partly because France benefits from a very strong youth development system. This model works as long as player sales offset the losses, but it becomes extremely fragile as soon as the market slows down, a European qualification is missed, or a broadcaster withdraws. In this system, European qualification can become a vital financial objective for certain clubs. A French club that misses out on Europe can instantly lose a huge share of its expected revenue. In some cases, the gap can represent between 30 and 70% of the projected income for the following season. That is massive. Conversely, qualification can completely transform a club's financial health. In a recent European campaign, Paris Saint-Germain exceeded 140 million euros in revenue from the Champions League in a single season. For clubs such as Lille, Monaco, or Brest, earnings surpassed 50 million euros. For some, this represented up to 1.5 times their annual budget. This means that a successful European campaign can be worth more than an entire domestic season. This system has created a very clear divide within French football itself. On one side, clubs that rely primarily on European competitions to survive financially. On the other, those that depend mainly on domestic TV rights. The former can breathe thanks to Europe. The latter suffocate as soon as TV revenues decline, as has been the case in recent years. And over time, the gap between these two groups continues to widen. Faced with this situation, French football executives attempted a radical solution in 2025 to create their own broadcaster, a channel meant to save the league's economy. But this attempt would also reveal a much deeper problem. At first, the objective is simple: To counter the collapse of the broadcasting market by creating its own platform to remove intermediaries, collect subscription revenue directly, and capture the value of its product itself. On paper, the idea seems logical. If broadcasters are no longer willing to pay the expected price, then it might as well become its own broadcaster. This is how Ligue 1 Plus was launched in July 2025. The initial subscription price is set at €14.99 per month, but that is not the amount that actually goes back to the clubs. Once VAT, technical costs, distribution expenses, and commissions are deducted, the net amount recovered by the league would be around €5 to €7 per subscriber per month. With 1 million subscribers, that would represent roughly €70 million per year. With 2 million subscribers, around €140 million. Compared to the French League's former broadcasting deals, these figures remain very low. Even with an ambitious target of 2 million subscribers, the new platform would still fall far short of those previous levels, and would return to revenue figures comparable to what the French League was earning at the end of the 1990s, more than 25 years ago. But beyond TV rights and the structural deficit of French clubs, another issue is present: internal conflicts within the leadership of French football itself. If revenues in French football are declining, it is also largely a matter of governance. For several seasons, broadcasting negotiations have failed, strategies have shifted repeatedly, and internal tensions have weakened collective decision-making. Even at the top of the system, instability is visible. The CEO of LFP Media, recruited to manage the Ligue 1 Plus channel, resigned after only a few months, clear evidence of the internal difficulties in building a sustainable strategy. In other words, the French crisis is not only financial, it is also organizational. One detail perfectly illustrates this fragility: the 2026 World Cup. To understand it, we need to go back to the basics. A platform that broadcasts a domestic league depends on the sporting calendar. Yet between June and August, Ligue 1 is on break. Without matches, subscriptions drop. And when subscriptions drop, revenues follow. To avoid this audience gap, the Ligue 1 Plus channel considered acquiring the broadcasting rights to international competitions, notably the 2026 World Cup, in order to retain subscribers over the summer, or even gain new ones. But this type of operation depends directly on decisions made by French football executives themselves, who must approve or reject rights acquisition strategies. And this is where the situation becomes unusual. Among these decision makers is also the president of the most powerful club in the league, Nasser Al-Khelaifi, who also heads a competing audiovisual group that could seek to acquire those same rights, beIN Sports. In other words, at the very heart of the system, certain decisions may end up being shaped by overlapping interests. This observation brings us back to a central actor, Paris Saint-Germain. The club occupies a unique position within the French ecosystem. On one hand, its role is vital. It is the club that attracts international attention. It generates the largest audiences. It earns the most UEFA coefficient points for the league, and it collects the highest European prize money. Without a locomotive of this scale, the league's international exposure would be significantly weaker. One could even question where France would stand in the UEFA coefficient rankings if PSG did not exist. But there is another side to the equation. The more one club concentrates resources, the wider the economic gap becomes with the rest. And the wider that gap grows, the more the overall balance of the league depends on that same club. And the more a league depends on a single club, the more influence that club holds in decision-making. PSG therefore acts both as a stabilizer of the system and as a sign of its fragility, an essential economic lifeline, but also proof that a league cannot sustainably rely on a single financial engine. What is unfolding in France today goes beyond a simple TV rights crisis. French football is reaching the end of an economic model it relied on for years without truly questioning it. While other leagues were building global commercial power, developing their brands, merchandising, and international strategies, Ligue 1 remained far more dependent on a single pillar, broadcasting. And when that pillar weakens, everything else weakens with it. The real question is therefore this: can French football survive without fundamentally changing its economic model? Tell me in the comments what you think. Also, if a specific point from the video caught your attention and you would like a deeper analysis in a dedicated video, whether on governance, TV rights, or any other aspect, let me know in the comments. And in any case, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like it, boost it, and subscribe so you don't miss the next ones.